On January 10, 1972, a highway patrolman driving on Highway 1, California, spotted two severed human arms along the side of the road. According to fingerprints and chest x-rays, each of the parts belonged to Cynthia Ann Shaw, who was reported missing on January 8, 1972. Police still had no clues about the real identity of the killer, but press had named him the Co-Ed Killer. Edmund Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California, the middle child and only son of Edmund Kemper Jr. and Clarnell Strandberg. Ed had a troubled childhood, only made more difficult by his huge size, 6'9" and nearly 300 pounds. As a child, Kemper and his dad were close, but his parents divorced when he was 9 years old, and Kemper ended up living with his mother in Helena, Montana. There, she regularly locked her son in the basement over fears that he would violate his younger sister, perhaps due to his large size. My mother and my sisters would go upstairs to bed, where I used to go to bed, and I had to go down to the basement, Kemper said in an interview. An 8-year-old child had a tough time differentiating the reasons. I'm saying I wanted to kill my mother since I was 8 years old. I'm not proud of that. His mother also taunted her son by comparing him to his father, and said he would be equally unsuccessful with women. She called Kemper a real weirdo. You're just like your father. She used to scream at Kemper, who soon realized that his mother hated him, her only son, because I was a constant reminder of that failure. She took her violent hatred of my father out on me. During those days, Ed would let out his anger on the dolls his sister played with, and this later became a signature move. You hear that little pop and pull their heads off and hold their heads up by the hair, whipping their heads off, their bodies sitting there. That'd get me off. Soon, however, he lost interest in his sister's dolls and begun torturing the family cats. He'd bury one alive, then later dug it up, decapitated it, and placed the head on the end of a stick like a demented trophy of war, while second one was stabbed and hacked into pieces by Ed with a machete. The never-ending verbal abuse finally led him to leave in 1964, and at the age of 15, the boy with an IQ of 145 dropped out of classes at Sierra Joints Union High School and ran away to live with his father. Once there, however, he learned that his father had remarried and he had a new family. The elder Kemper instead placed his son in the care of his parents, Edmund and Maud Kemper, who lived on a 17-acre ranch in the mountains of North Fork, California. There, he found his grandmother to be an authoritarian and a disciplinarian, just like his mother. I couldn't please her, Kemper said. It was like being in jail. I became a walking time bomb and I finally blew. For his first Christmas at the ranch, Kemper's grandfather gave him a .22 caliber rifle to shoot rabbits and other small game around the farm. Instead, on August 27, 1964, Kemper used it to kill Maud Kemper, shooting her 3 times in the back of the head while she sat at the kitchen table. To make sure he had finished the job, he also stabbed her a few times in the back with a kitchen knife. Kemper then waited, and when his grandfather pulled up to the house, shot him in the back of the head. Kemper's mother advised him to call the police, which he did, and waited patiently on his grandparents' front porch for authorities to arrive. After his arrest, he underwent a barrage of psychiatric testing. Despite having a near-genius IQ, it was determined that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Later, when he was asked why he'd done it, he nonchalantly responded that, "I just wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma." Kemper ended up being placed in Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane. The psychiatric staff at Atascadero found him to be both smart and personable. During his stay at the facility, Kemper, through his good behavior, gained access to materials that allowed him to master the test questions he would later be asked in order to prove that he had, in fact, been rehabilitated during his stay at Atascadero. He intentionally led all the psychiatrists to believe that he was normal. Kemper was released on his 21st birthday, and although a psychiatrist recommended he not have contact or live with his mother, he was nonetheless returned to her care. Almost immediately, the verbal abuse began again. "For 7 years, I haven't been with a man because of you, my murderous son," Kemper recalled his mother saying. Kemper's mother had left Montana and resettled in California, this time in Santa Cruz, where she had a job as an administrative assistant at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Ed got his GED at the local community college, and although he hoped to become a police officer, he was too tall. It seemed that his size was the sole reason for the rejection. So, he landed a job with the California Division of Highways, working as a road construction flagman. He eventually saved enough money to buy himself a motorcycle, but he crashed the bike, suffering a head injury in the process. The settlement he won after the accident allowed him to purchase a car, a yellow 1969 Ford Galaxy. His mother gave him a university staff parking sticker, but also made sure to advise her son that he was never going to attract the pretty co-eds at the school. This relentless ridicule eventually led him to decide he would get the very girls he coveted, one way or another, in part as a way to get back at the mother who thought her son wasn't good enough to find love. His new two-door car would be his weapon. Kemper initially was hoping to establish relationships and make friends by picking up people he saw hitchhiking along the highway. He found himself attracted to the girls he picked up hitchhiking, as many as 150, but was unable to effectively romance them and feared that if he violated them, he was so recognizable that he would easily be caught. It was May 7, 1972, and Mary Ann Pesce and Anita Lucchesa, who were students at the University of California, were hitchhiking to visit some friends at Berkeley. Pesce was 5'1", wearing a maroon sweatshirt and faded blue jeans. Lucchesa was also 5'1", a blonde with gold-rimmed glasses, and was wearing a white shirt with denim. Both girls were 18 years old. Mary Ann had more experience hitchhiking as she had hitchhiked through Europe and was less trusting of the awkward Kemper, despite the habits he had developed to help his victims feel calm and more likely to get into his car. Normally, he would check his watch as if he wasn't sure he had enough time to pick anyone up, making himself seem casual rather than too eager. She was a howdy young lady, stuck up, a valley girl. She was playing Little Miss Distant with me and she didn't want to get in the car, Kemper said. Her roommate Anita, however, was much more open, and after asking Kemper where he was headed, jumped into the front seat. Eventually, Mary Ann got in the back seat, although according to Kemper, she kept a close eye on him as they drove. Although Anita was more flirty, it was Mary Ann that Kemper found most attractive, which ultimately sealed her fate as his first victim. As they watched each other in the rearview mirror, Kemper was formulating his plan, and he drove the young woman to a remote area, turned off his car, and brandished his gun. Kemper had already mapped out a plan to prevent his prey's escape. He would say, "Hey, I don't think your door is closed," and he was so big he could reach all the way across the car. When he did, he would open and close the door to secure it, and then would drop something small like a tube of chapstick behind the mechanism of the door handle, so the door wouldn't open and his passenger would be trapped. Kemper began his co-ed murder spree by tying up Anita at gunpoint and forcing her into the trunk. He then turned his attention to Ann Pesce in the back seat. "I stabbed her and she didn't fall dead. They're supposed to fall dead. I've seen it in all the movies. It doesn't work that way. When you stab someone, they leak to death," he said. He then backed up out of the car and said, "Shit, now I've got to kill the other one." He then headed back to the trunk, where the terrified Anita was handcuffed behind her back. She sees the blood running on my hands and says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Your friend got smart with me. She got really smart with me and I hit her. I think I broke her nose. You better come help." Anita began crawling out of the trunk and Kemper went in for the kill, again using the pawn shop knife. "When I attacked her, at first she didn't know what was happening," he said. Eventually, however, Anita fell back into the trunk, dead of her injuries, and Kemper slammed the trunk shut. It was then he started to panic. After regaining his composure, Kemper also deposited Mary Ann in his trunk. Once Kemper arrived at his apartment in Alameda, he waited until dark, then took both bodies to his bedroom, where he decapitated them and then returned the bodies to his trunk, dumping some parts in the grove of redwood trees alongside a remote highway, others in a brushy area that was also fairly remote. Mary Ann's trunk, minus her arms and legs, was buried. Kemper kept both heads in his car for a while. In due course of time, the heads began to decompose, so he threw both of them into a ravine. As his crimes continued, he developed a taste for necrophilia, as well as decapitating and chopping up his victims, acts that only added to the horror of his crimes, but also initially earned him nicknames like the Chopper and the Butcher in newspaper reports before the co-ed killer stuck. I remember Ed being there on many occasions, especially when the homicides were going on. He would come in and have a few beers with the guys and talk to us, said Jim Connor, a former City of Santa Cruz police officer. That's apparently why officers unwittingly gave Kemper a pair of handcuffs that he used later to control his victims. On the evening of September 14, 1972, 15-year-old Aiko Ku accepted a ride with Ed Kemper and was never seen again. Kemper told authorities he drove her to an isolated location in the mountains above Santa Cruz. "I pulled the gun out to show her I had it. She was freaking out. Then I put the gun away, and that had more effect on her than pulling it out." At one point, he locked himself out of his car, but hysterical Koo let him back in. He then taped her mouth shut and pinched her nostrils together until she blacked out. He then strangled her to make sure she was dead. He followed his previous modus operandi and took Koo's body back to his apartment where he dismembered her. "I remember it was very exciting. It was kind of an exalted, triumphant type thing," Kemper said. "Like taking the head of a deer or an elk or something would be to a hunter. I was the hunter and they were the victims." He disposed of her body but kept Koo's head, which he stashed in the trunk of his car. It was there the next day when he attended a psychiatric parole hearing and didn't miss a beat telling the mental health professionals exactly what they wanted to hear. Kemper saw 2 doctors that day. He said that he saw no indication that Kemper was a danger, while the second one called the depraved serial killer both normal and safe. Kemper was given a clean bill of health and then went to bar the jury room, which was mostly frequented by cops for a few drinks. First, however, he opened his trunk to take another look at Koo's head. "I suppose I was standing there looking. I was doing one of those triumphant things too, admiring my work and admiring her beauty. And I might say, admiring my catch like a fisherman," he said. He later buried Koo's head in his mother's garden, joking about how his mother always wanted people to look up to her. On January 8th, 1973, 1 week after the new year, Cynthia Ann Shaw made a fatal mistake when she accepted a ride with Kemper. She was on her way to her home in Santa Cruz. Cynthia was babysitting to earn money for college, and one of her regular babysitting gigs was for Santa Cruz police officer Jim Connor, who had spent plenty of time drinking with Kemper at the jury room. He drove her from Santa Cruz to nearby Watsonville, where he shot her, then drove the body back to his mother's duplex, where he was once again living. The next day, while his mother was away at work, he performed acts of necrophilia with the body, then dismembered it and packed the remains in plastic bags and boxes. Her head, however, he buried outside his bedroom window as a way to keep her close. On February 5th, 1973, Kemper and his mother got into a fight, and Ed stated that the next good-looking girl he saw would die. "I might not have been much to look at myself, but I always went for pretty girls," he said, "and I was so pissed I would have killed anyone who got in the car." Unfortunately, 2 students who had stayed late to study missed the last buses to leave campus, were the ones to accept his offer of a ride. 22-year-old Rosalind Thorpe on that day spent too much time at the library, and when it closed at 9 p.m., she headed to the bus stop, arms full of books, hoping the last bus hadn't already passed her stop. It was a rainy night, and when Kemper spotted her standing at the bus stop illuminated by a streetlight, it was easy for him, especially driving his 1969 Ford with the university staff's parking sticker, to entice the unlucky girl into his car. Kemper rolled down the passenger window and leaned out, telling Rosalind, "The bus is gone, I know. I've missed it before too. Can I give you a lift? It's pretty late." She got in the car and they drove off. The two only drove a few blocks before Kemper noticed Alice Liu, 21, who had also spent too long at the campus library and was wondering how she was going to get home from school. When Kemper's car slowed down, Liu also noticed the university's staff sticker, as well as Rosalind in the front seats, so she climbed into the back seat with no worries whatsoever. All the while, still driving down the road, he was maneuvering his gun from near his foot to his lap. He then picked it up and pulled the trigger, killing Rosalind, who slumped against the passenger door window. In the back seat, Alice was frantic, panicked, and struggling to escape Kemper's bullets. "I had to fire through her hands," he recalled. "She was moving around, and I missed twice." He took the 2 girls back to his mother's. The next morning, he tossed body parts of both girls in the ocean. Occasionally unidentifiable scraps turned up. A woman's hand without fingers, a female pelvic bone, 1 breast. Authorities would later learn that Kemper was a cannibal as well as a necrophiliac, which accounted for the missing body parts. On 20th of April 1973, Kemper worked half a day and before coming home contemplated his mother's death, which he had been planning for a week. "I wanted to kill my mother since I was 8 years old. I hated her," he told one interviewer. He came home late and stopped in her bedroom to let her know he was home, hoping that she would say something nice to him to stop the inevitable murder. Instead of greeting him, the woman who was tucked in bed with a book said, "Oh my God, Now I suppose you're going to want to stay up late and talk all night." I was hoping that she would say something that would stop this shit, Kemper said, but instead, the last words we shared were a fight. Usually, she would apologize the next day when she hurt her son's feelings, but this time, she didn't get a chance. At about 5 a.m., before the sun was up, Kemper murdered his mother while she was asleep. To ease his guilt, he headed to the bar where he tossed back a few with his cop buddies, but still felt his sadistic urges had not yet been satisfied. This time, to ease his rage, he invited his mother's best friend, 59-year-old Sally Howlett, over for dinner. I came up behind her and crooked my arm around her neck like this, he told a reporter with Front Page Detective, demonstrating for her by bending his arm at his chin. I squeezed and just lifted her off the floor. She just hung there, and for a moment, I didn't realize she was dead. I'd broken her neck, and her head was just wobbling around with the bones of her neck disconnected in the skin sac of her neck. 3 days later, he called the Santa Cruz police from a telephone booth and confessed to murdering his mother. Santa Cruz police were surprised when they received a phone call from the Pueblo phone booth. The caller was 24-year-old Edmund Kemper, the guy they called Big Ed, confessing to the murders of not only the co-eds, but also his mother and her best friend. The first time, police thought he was joking, but when Kemper called back, another officer, Jim Connor, whose babysitter had died at the hands of the co-ed killer, took the call. "I killed my mother and her friend, and I killed those college girls. I killed 6 of them, and I can show you where I hid the pieces of their bodies," he said. Hearing this, Officer Jim Connor asked a deputy to stop by his mother's house and check the place. When the officer arrived, the place looked relatively normal, but in the bedroom, it was a different story. On the bed, now saturated with blood, Kemper had dismembered and mutilated his 2 victims. The claw hammer and a 3-foot saber with a curved bloody blade were also found nearby. The first officer to reach Kemper had been warned about Kemper's size and weaponry and approached him with caution, but he put up no resistance during the arrest. Kemper pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity and twice attempted unsuccessfully to slash his wrist with a ballpoint pen to bolster his defense. He was sentenced to 7 years to life for each count, with his sentences to run concurrently. Like you guys, I always had a keen interest in serial killers and was always curious to learn as to what makes them click and what makes them commit these horrible crimes in such a gruesome manner. And besides looking for it frantically, I haven't been able to find one scientific scale against which all of the serial killers could be rated based on certain attributes. The only closer thing I could find is the most evil scale from Dr. Michael Stone, a professor at Columbia University, which is also featured in Discovery Channel show of the same name. The scale categorizes all serial killers into 4 separate groups, with individual levels in each one of the groups. I would instead like all of the serial killers to be represented by one number that rates them based on selective criteria. Therefore, for this video, I have tried to conjure up a scale of my own to rate all of the serial killers that I would cover in my future videos. For the creation of the scale, Pew's decision matrix was used. I'm looking forward to any feedback that you guys might have to improve this scale in future videos. So, let's begin first with the attributes. It doesn't actually take a superior mind to kill another human being, but cunning, sophisticated, manipulative, elegant, fiercely intelligent. There are certain personality traits and characteristics which spring to mind when you consider a typical serial killer. Therefore, I have selected intelligence as the foremost criteria and have given it a weightage of 30%. Each killer gets a score on a scale of 1 to 10 against that particular criteria, and then weightage is multiplied to it. Later score for each is summed up, and we get a final score within a range of 1 to 10. The higher the score one serial killer has, the more cunning, elusive, deceitful, and psychopathic he was. Most serial killers look for an ideal victim to fulfill their fantasies and fetishes. Therefore, I have given this a weightage of 20%. If the serial killer has put a lot of thought into selecting his victims, then he gets a higher score. If the serial killer has left a meticulous scene of crime with no evidence, then he gets a higher score. Weightage for this is 25%. Serial killers who show no remorse or guilt get a higher score against this criteria. Weightage for this is set at 15%. I am of the opinion that victims count alone is never a good criterion to assess the lethality of a serial killer. Mass murders don't need a brain to achieve higher soul count than most serial killers. Therefore, I've given it a weightage of 10%. As I have already covered Zodiac Killer in my very first video, therefore, I would also like to rate him along with Ed as per this matrix. So, Starting from our first criteria, intelligence, I would rate Zodiac a 10 out of 10 because of his uncracked deciphers to this date, and because the case has still not been solved officially. He was definitely someone with a higher intelligence. Edmund Kemper had an IQ of 145. He was big, strong, savage, and an extremely bright man, with both brains and brawn. He got away with 8 murders, and if he had not turned himself in, I don't think police would have been able to get to him that easily. Therefore, Ed gets a score of 9 here. As per my knowledge, both Zodiac and Ed chose their victims based on chance instead of a carefully thought out plan. Some people do say that Zodiac selected his victims based on their zodiac sign, but that seems too far-fetched to me. Therefore, I have given them both a score of 7 here. After committing his crimes, Zodiac never left any significant clues whatsoever, while in case of Ed, there were moments where he was about to be caught and simply got away with the murders by chance. Therefore, Zodiac gets a score of 9 and Ed gets a score of 7 here. Both Zodiac and Ed were quite violent while finishing the job, but Ed took it to another level by dismembering his victims, along with necrophilia and cannibalism. Therefore, Ed gets a score of 10 here, while Zodiac, who did nothing of that sort to the bodies of his victims, gets a score of 7. Zodiac claimed that he had killed 37 people, although there were 7 confirmed deaths. But I think there might have been a few more that were never attributed to him, so he gets a score of 9, while Ed gets a score of 7 here. In the end, we end up with a total score of 8.6 for the Zodiac and 8.1 for Ed Kemper. Which serial killer would you guys like me to cover up next? Please leave your comments and suggestions below. Stay healthy, stay safe. John Red.